Hello, what's up? Thanks for downloading this video. My name's Miles, I work as an illustrator, I love to work in pencil, and yeah, I'd like to try and share some tips and tricks and things that have helped me improve my pencil rendering over the years, and so I'm going to try and give you an overview of my workflow, all the materials I use normally, some insight into the kind of thought process that goes behind creating my images, and I'll also try and go into depth about all the pencil rendering techniques I use in this video, so you can try them yourself. But to begin, I just thought I'd quickly outline the materials I'm using throughout this video. The primary tool is my trusty mechanical pencil. It's 0.3 millimeters. There's nothing really special about this brand or anything. In fact, the brand is worn off the side, so I can't actually tell you which one it is. But if you don't really need smaller than 0.5, but at the size I work, 0.3 is a bit better, and I'm kind of really into complex hatching and lots of tiny marks, so it helps with that. Next up in order of importance would be a kneadable eraser. A hard eraser is good too, but this lets you really control your tones and edges in a more delicate manner than a hard eraser would. Once again, I don't really think brand is particularly important, but I have found erasers that are too soft and it kind of feels like trying to work with a piece of chewing gum. So just, I don't know, shop around until you find one that's nice. They don't cost very much. A tool that I've really grown to love that I don't see all that many people using is this mechanical eraser thing. It's awesome for cutting out hard edges and really sculpting your lines properly. I use it all the time now. I only found it about a year ago. And this particular one is called a Mono Zero eraser pen, and I like the one with the square edge the most. This is the brand of pencil lead I use for refills. HB is enough for the value range I get, and there's nothing particularly about this brand that I like. It's just what the art supply store near me happens to sell. I've used a whole different bunch. I mean, if I had one message really, it would be not to obsess too much about materials and think more about technique, but I think it is helpful just to go into this a little bit. You'll probably see me using this paper blending tool a whole bunch throughout the video. I love it for making tiny adjustments to edges, softening them, or filling in small areas that are too small to smudge with my finger. I think it's a really good way to sort of plan your value scheme and ease your way into the rendering process and kind of bridge that gap between line drawing and values. And another thing you might see me using a lot in this video that I've really grown to love is these Cretacolor graphite chunks. And this piece is a sort of 6B block of graphite. You can see it's been worn down. I've been using this one for about a year and a half now. They start off like 10 centimeters long and with really hard edges, and you can get amazing textures out of them by you can kind of use it like a giant square chalk brush or something. It's really cool. You don't need it, but it's a great shortcut, and I would really recommend it if you sometimes feel a bit limited in your mark making, or if you're someone who doesn't have a very easy time thinking in terms of lines and prefers to think about edge and shape. And lastly, I guess my favorite tool for blending is smudging with a finger. Pictured here is my finger in case you forgot what they look like. But I think it's really helpful. It helps me stay kind of in a flow state when I don't feel like I'm moving a million techniques around, and I can sort of quickly adjust the line just using my fingers, and you can sort of lightly lay graphite down over an area and then blend it in with your finger, or you can use it to sort of blur a section that's become too sharp or that's jumping forwards too much. Just make sure you keep your hands clean, obviously. I know it sounds obvious, but it's really easy to just pick up on like a tiny bit of sweat or a little crumb of food or something, and sometimes if you get some greasiness in the paper, you're just never going to be able to erase it, which can be really frustrating if it's on like the focal point. So now that I've addressed the basic materials I've used, there's a couple more things to think about before you begin. I like to have the light coming from the left as I'm right-handed, and ideally a lamp at a low angle or natural light to avoid glare as much as possible. The glare is basically a sort of reflection of the light source in your graphite, so if you've got the right angle between your paper and your eyes, you're going to keep getting tons of glare, and it can actually be really distracting if you're trying to render. So I found if you're in a sort of reasonably dark environment and have a lamp coming at a low angle from the left-hand side, or natural light works pretty well. You know, next to a nice window, that's the best. That's the best lighting situation. And also just try and get rid of as many distractions as you can. If you hadn't noticed, drawing is pretty difficult, and it takes a lot of concentration. And if you like phone notifications are going off, or people need your attention every couple of minutes, it can really take away from the sort of thinking that you need to put into the drawing itself. So it's nice to sort of, even small bits of advice that I wish I had gotten into a habit of doing is, if you're going to listen to music, just set up a whole playlist for a few hours, because even having to dedicate the thinking to which song you want to listen to, or like changing podcast every few minutes, can be really, really distracting. And once you have all of that set up, try and get into the right kind of mindset to tackle a drawing. It's best to things like aiming to be finished as quickly as possible, or being entirely focused on the results, will sort of, more often than not, make everything take longer and make everything turn out worse. It's best to try and get into a mindset where you're going to enjoy solving the problems you've set out for yourself. And I like to try and come up with drawings where I'm not entirely sure how it's going to look when it's finished, or I don't know if it's going to work, so that there's a kind of suspense and sense of reward when things work out. Yeah, try not to sort of beat yourself up if things don't turn out good. That's fine. You got to make like 1,000 shitty drawings before you get to make any that look any good. And I don't think you'll ever get to a point where you'll stop failing, especially if you're tackling difficult enough problems. I think failure is a good thing. It's something that you get to learn from, and just try and have that mindset as much as possible before you begin, or how are you gonna enjoy it. So before I ever began this image, I spent a little while just doing some sketches at the back of my sketchbook, and this was the thumbnail that I settled upon before beginning this one. Some of the best advice I ever received about sketching and studying and drawing in general was to stop trying to make every single time pen or pencil touches the paper look good, and instead think about just getting information down, or actually learning about the things I was studying. And I think this is really relevant for thumbnailing and sketching. Before you jump in, it's really helpful to have a kind of basic idea of where you're going to go with things. So it really helps me. I'll sometimes just kind of explore different ways I could represent the idea I have in my head. Our mind's eyes are actually pretty bad, I think. You sort of feel like you know what something looks like, but in the process of getting it down, it's often very vague. And I'm someone who likes to work a lot of things out as I go through an image, especially in pictures that have a sort of lot of organic looking patterns or things like that. Obviously you can't plan how they look, but you can still plan the general layout of the page, where you're going to place different elements. Obviously the sketch is kind of simple, it's just a face in the middle of a page, there's no real composition to it, but you still get to, there's all kinds of decisions that were made during this drawing. The exact placement of the gap in the face, how far apart that was going to be, where the light was going to be coming from. There's a sort of beam of light casting across her face, and I had to decide which angle the shadow was going to be at. And all of these things are best explored on a thumbnail. So when you're ready to begin your actual drawing, there are several different approaches. A lot of people like to go in with if you're going to draw in pen, then you sort of go in with your finished lines immediately, and that requires a good deal of visualization beforehand. But when I'm going to really render out a piece like this, I use a sort of a method of sketching that's mostly informed by the time I spent studying at a traditional art school, or an atelier as they're called. And they teach you a lot in the first year to follow the method of an artist called Charles Barg. He has these amazing figure studies, which I'm going to put on the left here. And as you can see, they have really simplified forms and lines, and the idea behind this method is everything you put down first is normally going to be incorrect. So in a sense, it's more about just kind of getting rid of the white paper and putting something down, and then starting to learn how to correct those things as best as possible. And you always want to lay in the big proportions and structure as quickly as possible, because everything else is kind of built on top of that framework, and if they're wrong, then you're just going to end up with a really shiny turd. So I try and sketch with pretty blocky lines and focus on getting the general idea of the drawing in as quickly as possible. And my reasoning behind this is that if you sort of go and draw an eye with every eyelash immediately and go into all this detail, and then you found that you've drawn it on the wrong place on the face, you have to redo all that time that you invested into that piece of the drawing, which can get very frustrating really quickly. But if you kind of just block the eyes in as a couple of straight lines, and then you find one's in the wrong place, it's 10 seconds of effort to fix it. So I think that's the best way to avoid getting really frustrated as you begin. If I was following a sort of stricter traditional method, you would complete the line drawing fully before you jump in any further. But at this point, I don't really like to do that anymore. I like to think about the light from a very early point. So I tend to sort of jump ahead into finding shadow shapes second. And so the next stage for me is plotting the main shadow shapes. I want to be thinking about lighting from very early on, which is why it's good to have this figured out from the beginning. I don't really think in terms of I don't want to do an entire drawing and then shade it. I kind of think of light as the thing that ultimately you're trying to draw. When you're making a drawing, you're thinking about how light illuminates form, but you're also thinking about design and composition, and depending on the image really, or the style you want to work in, it might be more appropriate to modify your method. So there's no one way to do a drawing. Certain kinds of drawings will require you to really be careful in the initial planning stages, and others it's fine to just go straight into rendering without any lines. And I think it's really important to do as many different kind of workflows as possible, because even if you do things that are completely wrong, it's gonna really benefit your sort of experience as an artist. You're gonna learn what kind of results you get from working in different ways, and you might discover a way of working you really love, or some style you sort of accidentally stumble upon. So yeah, there's basically no concrete way to do it correctly. So I can kind of just talk about what I'm doing in this image. And because I know that it's a pretty simple scene and there's not sort of like a huge amount of room for major error in terms of where my elements are positioned on the page and stuff like that, I'm kind of just going ahead and skipping a few stages and beginning to put in the lighting immediately. I don't jump straight into my full values. I tend to sort of create at first a low contrast approximation of how the rendering is going to be. So I start thinking immediately about which areas are going to be left as paper white, and then I start to slowly block in shades of grey on anything else around there to kind of start seeing the shapes of my highlights. And to lay in these grey halftones, this is one of those places where I'll use a lot of smudging. Where I'll get my pencil and I'll roughly shade across an entire area, and then I'll just blend it all together with my finger or with a paper blender to kind of even it out to that sort of halftone. As you can see, I just moved the entire lower half of the face, so this is an example of the consequence of poor planning. But I think this was something that became more apparent in the actual drawing than in the thumbnail, where I felt like the negative space between the two halves of the face, the bottom and top, were lined up in this way that was really unsatisfying. It was like maybe a kind of strange tangent or something, but it was ruining the depth because there was no overlap on the sides of the face, which kind of I just found it very visually irritating. So I think if you're going to jump ahead steps and rush into a drawing, it's okay as long as you're always willing to correct things when you see them, and if you work in a manner where it's possible for you to correct. The more complicated the image is, the more necessary it becomes to plan them properly, because it's almost impossible to it's easy enough if all I have to do here is change the drawing on one face, but if it was something like moving an entire figure in the middle of a painting, that's sort of like an unnecessary headache that would better be solved in the sketching stage. In this case, I think it was more of a matter of seeing the drawing bigger revealed some things that I hadn't really thought of yet. And I don't mind stuff like that. I think it's kind of fun when, in a sense, I like to not really know how it's going to look when it's finished. I think there's always something kind of surprising about... I love being surprised by how something turns out. So I don't mind leaving small decisions open. And sometimes I'll intentionally leave whole areas of the drawing blank, just in my head thinking, I'm going to wait until I have an idea that really feels right or feels exciting enough. And yeah, I think that's enjoyable. Otherwise, sometimes to me it feels a little bit like spoilers to a book or a movie or something. If I know exactly how it's going to unfold, it takes away my motivation to see it through to the end. If you start getting really stuck at this point, and things don't look right and you just can't figure out why, instead of sort of bashing your head against the wall, it's a good idea to really sit down and think about why things aren't turning the way you expected them. Do you not really understand enough about your subject to perhaps draw it without a reference? Or is this something you need to study more? Like if the anatomy's not working, or the perspective feels off, or the proportions feel wrong, that's when it's a good time to go away and think about what kind of studies you should be doing to supplement you at this point. Drawing is always going to be, and by drawing I mean the sort of structural block-in and the actual things about the not basically everything except the values or the shading or the rendering, as people call it, is what I would call the drawing. And that's always going to be the real backbone of an image and the most important part. And it's really hard to draw something that you don't understand. So if there's anything in your piece that you don't have a sort of developed understanding of, it's good to go away maybe and just do a couple of studies from life or from photos, and come back to your image once you feel like you can tackle it a bit better. Once the general structure of the piece is on the page, so in this drawing now, things are sort of generally in the right place. I'm fairly happy with the basic proportions. I feel like I've kind of solved the broader errors. So now I like to go in and start focusing on things one at a time. It can kind of be frustrating when you feel like you're working everywhere on a drawing, but it's not getting any better because you're kind of working here and there, but not actually finishing anything. And it can kind of give you this sort of in limbo feeling where you lose a few hours and someone will come by and say, has anything changed? Which I'm sure everyone has had that experience. So it can be helpful to go in and just say, like, okay, for the next 20 minutes I'm going to work on one eye, or I'm going to just solve the nose, or just solve the ear. And I think it's really helpful for motivational reasons too. Motivation and addiction and kind of your desire to do anything seem to be dependent on dopamine, and video games exploit this really well. It's why even if you're exhausted, you can sit down without needing to drink 4 cups of coffee and just play video games for 6 hours solid. They've really studied and mastered exploiting the brain's reward systems to keep you interested. And my little pseudoscience-y thoughts on drawing is that it's very important that you see areas specifically looking better, so you get that little reward rush or that sense that things are being accomplished. So sometimes it's good just to go, I'm going to put some darker values in, I'm going to work on just this one eye and get it looking nice, so that you feel like something's being accomplished and that you're not just kind of sat there for hours and hours while nothing's happening. And I mean, I have no idea if that's really scientifically correct, but it's a method that's helped me personally stay on task for longer periods of time. So kind of breaking your image down into individual areas and giving them, you know, a little bit of focus. But it's very important that you don't do this before the general sort of skeleton and structure of the image is in. And that's where some good mental discipline to sort of stay in the sketching stage for as long as possible will really pay off in the end. As you can see, I've already laid in some very dark areas, and basically all you have is, if you're working with like a 0.3 mechanical pencil or something with a small lead, it's really useful to make sure that the piece of pencil tip sticking out the end is as small as possible. This will allow you to push as hard as possible without it breaking all the time. And I found that actually the smaller the lead, the darker the value you can get out, and I think this is probably something to do with there being more pressure with a smaller surface area on the pencil tip. So I make sure it's really small just by sort of clicking it out and then adjusting it with my finger, and then just push as hard as possible, and you should be able to get that dark pretty easily. More often than not, the appearance of very dark values is actually about how you've structured the value range more than it's about how dark the darkest darks are. Really all there is to getting black out of a pencil is you just push really hard, and you have to make sure that you're using paper that can handle it. There's a measurement called GSM, which is grams per square meter, and I find anything above 200 that isn't too grainy should be good. If it's too grainy, it kind of seems like, I think it gets in the way of the mark making for me, and it kind of tears up more easily. I have a moleskin that I bought from the past year, the one that you're seeing me working in right here, and I think the paper's gotten even softer. I've found a few times where I've actually torn the paper with the pencil tip because it's so sharp, but you can kind of cover up any little tears just by carefully working in again on top of that. But yeah, so the appearance of a huge value range is much more about how you structure your values than it is about the values themselves. So when you work in pencil, you have a very limited value range, especially compared to charcoal or oil or, you know, digital, anything like that. You have a much broader value range, and obviously the eye can see a huge range of values. As anyone who's learned anything about exposure with camera photography will have noticed, the human eye is much more sensitive to seeing a big range of values. So it's not actually about matching values, it's about matching the relationships between them. To create a good sense of light, all you need is the right sense of contrast between the brightest value on your drawing and everything else. So your brightest value is clearly set at paper white. You can't make the paper any lighter. So the only way to increase the sense of contrast and therefore the sense of light is to make everything else darker relative to that value. Let's imagine for a second that this value range here represents the full range of values that the human eye can see from black to white. And this second value scale here represents the range of values you can get out of a pencil from paper white to the human eye. In fact, it's probably a lot smaller than that. The white of paper is much less bright than, say, looking into a light bulb or looking into the sun, just for some comparison. So we have to try and represent the full range of contrast and value that we see in the real world using our highly limited value range, and that's what keying a drawing is called. So a low-key drawing is one where you place an emphasis on contrast in the lower half of the value range. So your highlights kind of become quite dark, or there aren't very many on the page. It's that kind of very black and grey, heavy value range. There's no correct way to key any drawing. It should all be informed by your idea or the mood or atmosphere or narrative you want to tell. In fact, the value range you choose is very important for setting the sort of tone of your image. So low key is like that kind of stormy, dark look with a lot of blacks and a lot of heavy greys and very little white. Mid key is a kind of balance, you know, somewhere between the two. You don't have overexposed highlights, but you also don't have particularly heavy darks. It might be a mid-key image might be more useful for like a poster or something that needs to have, that's more about design and readable shapes than it is about sort of strong lighting effects. And then high key is where everything is sort of in the high, there's very little shadow and midtones, and there's a lot of very bright highlights, and you have the most contrast in the upper value range. When I work in pencil, because the value range is so limited, I like to do what's called compressing the highlights. So if you imagine that value scale again, I set the point at which my paper white is going to be, you know, maybe like 2/3 of the way up the total range of values that I can see with my human eye, and I just say everything above this point is going to be paper white. And then that means the values in that upper range that are being lost are being compressed. And I think that helps get an optimal range of values out of pencil. So I hope this doesn't sound overly technical, but basically you leave your top 20% of the value range at paper white. Like if you imagine actually looking at human skin, it's not just this blinding, it's not just, there's a whole range of values even in the upper half. There's usually specular highlights on people sometimes depending on the lighting conditions, and you'll notice in the final image that I've chosen to not have very much of this contrast at all, and this is done on purpose because of the limited range of values offered by pencil, and I think it allows your darks to look dark enough considering they're actually only like a sort of deep mid-tone on a broader range of values. So the whole point is all that's necessary to get the impression of light is not to actually match the full extent of values that you see in the real world, but it's just to maximize the contrast. And this is, like I said, this is not a rule so much as it is a stylistic choice. For me, I really like to have that. I think it helps get the mood and feeling that I want from my drawings to have a very strong sense of light and that sort of glowing look to the highlights. But there are tons of amazing pencil artists who work in a very low key. All of these decisions are easier to make if you make sure that the narrative and the mood and the story always comes first, which is why it's so important to have an idea that you understand and believe in before you get going, because every single step of the way you have to make technical decisions, and the more you can inform those decisions with a sort of sense of purpose, the better off your final image is going to be and the more complete it should be as a kind of visual statement. So just to recap, what I'm trying to explain here is that things on your page or within the boundaries of the canvas you're working on don't have to be objectively correct for us to understand them. A good metaphor is to think about drawing and measuring and proportion. You don't have to draw a face at exactly the same size as an actual human face in order for the viewer to understand that it's a person. You don't look at a drawing and say, oh, that's a tiny face. You understand that it's a small drawing of a face, and that's because the measurements aren't correct. They're just correct relative to each other, and values are exactly the same. Your values don't have to be correct, they just have to be correct relative to the value range you've chosen for your drawing and for all the values on the page that you have laid out. So right now, this looks pretty strange on my drawing because I don't have any background value in yet, so it's a little confusing. All the grey on her doesn't quite read as a shadow yet across like her neck, and it looks kind of flat, but I have in my head planned already the value scheme so that I can get rid of that. As you can see, I'm starting to block in the background now to really think more about which areas of the page are going to be left blank. But this idea of getting things correct just relative to what's on the paper is really important. Another good way to ensure that your values are reading correctly is to include a nice range of materials. One of the biggest beginner mistakes that you see a lot is people render every single element of a drawing black to white. So they sort of go in and focus on areas one at a time and use their entire range of values all at once in every single place. So they render the eye from their darkest dark to their lightest light, and then they go over and render like the t-shirt folds from the absolute darkest dark to the lightest light. And this is a very easy way to quickly flatten your picture. Compositionally, it's very helpful to group values together, as it helps lead the eye around the piece, and also it's how you show what different materials are made of. So you might have noticed that pretty early on in this process I decided that her hair was a darker material than her skin. So if you go and look at someone with a dark hair color and actually compare the value of the highlights on their hair to the value of the highlights on their skin, you'll notice that even the brightest points on the hair might be darker than the value of the skin in the shadows. A very obvious example of this is wearing like a black or a white t-shirt or something that contrasts your skin tone, and you'll notice that if I'm wearing a black t-shirt, even the highlights on the black t-shirt are going to be darker than my skin tone is, often in the shadow. So this is something important to think about. Make sure you use limited value ranges for each different material. It'll really help you to add a sense of realism to your rendering. And different materials all respond completely differently to light, and that's just something that you have to study. In fact, that's where still lifes are incredibly helpful. When you go through a sort of atelier program and they teach you, I would argue that the only thing really taught in ateliers is drawing and values. And the program at Sara, where I help teach in Sweden, is in your first year you do some flat copies to help get the eye in and get an understanding of what accuracy is, and then you move on to cast drawings, which I think most people have seen when people copy plaster casts. And the reason you choose a plaster cast as your beginner exercise is that it removes a lot of the variables that come into play when you are rendering something. Those variables include how many light sources you have, the materials, and things like that. So in a cast drawing you have a single material which isn't too glossy and isn't too matte. It's kind of similar to skin. You have one light source and you have one material. I just said that. But this is to reduce the complexity, and it allows you to really understand the sort of fundamental relationships between light and form, which is what you need to understand to be able to render, especially from your imagination. Because you can always learn to sort of copy things from life or from photos, but if you want to render from your imagination, you have to sort of essentially, you have to understand the form, and then you have to understand how that light would interact with the form, and you kind of have to put it through a sort of rendering program in your head to help you figure out how things will look. And it sounds a lot harder than it is after a lot of practice, because you learn how to break down that complex thing into steps, and often my first pass of rendering is actually not very accurate at all, and then I'll slowly come back to each area piece by piece, and I'll really get in there and think about, you know, where bounced light may be coming from and all of these different things. But anyway, after you have done a lot of plaster casts, the sort of final stages of an atelier program are normally still lifes. And the reason a sort of still life is helpful, while it might seem boring at first, is you get to pick a whole bunch of different objects which ideally should have different materials, and set them up in a lighting situation that really lets you study the differences between those different materials. Working in color as well is something that adds an extra level of complexity that will definitely increase the difficulty of getting something right. But all of it comes down to your knowledge of values ultimately. You can take all of the hue out of a picture. You can put a color picture into black and white and still understand what it is, but you can't remove the values. It would just become a sort of blob of different colors, and it would be very hard to understand what you were looking at. So values are fundamentally how we represent the way light interacts with form, and it's the way, well, more accurately, we're studying the way the human brain represents the way light interacts with form, because really what we're learning to draw is the way our brain visualizes information around us. So I would recommend, if you really want to improve your rendering, set up some simple still lifes, or even maybe try simple cubes or basic shapes, and just really go in and aim for 100% accuracy, and do interesting things like pick objects that have different value ranges to them. You know, pick a sort of dark colored cube and a light colored cube, or like a Coke can next to like a sketchbook, or two things that have like radically different material properties, and then just sit down and try to draw both of them at the same time, being really careful about where you use your values. If there's a sort of if your brightest point is on a specular highlight on your, on like a piece of metal, don't then use the same value elsewhere in the piece, or you'll diminish its impact. And try and always think about your values across the entire image. That's something that I have planned, and it's starting to shape up now on the drawing. You can see I've using that piece of graphite that I was talking about earlier, I've roughed in the whole background, and I like to do that sometimes, like if on some of my more complicated pictures where there's a lot more going on than just a dark background, you can't just go ahead and block it in, because you'll it just becomes a mess pretty quickly. And sometimes you just have to just hold on in your head to the value scheme as you plan as it's going to look when everything's finished. And that's why that can be very satisfying sometimes when you finally get around to filling in the back. Let's imagine I wanted to draw a bunch of leaves behind her, or like some thorn bushes or something. I would have to go in and figure the whole drawing out first, so I wouldn't want to just smudge the entire background in first, which would mean for a long time the drawing would have like an incorrect sense of contrast, and you just have to kind of trust that it's going to work once you finally get around to filling in the rest of the image. So sometimes it can take a while before things start to look right, which can actually be really fun, because when you finally get around to blocking that stuff in, it can be very satisfying. So right now I'm starting to think about, as I was saying about materials earlier, I wanted to give her like a black dress with lacy sleeves, and this was just to show, I think I mentioned earlier that the shadow wasn't working on the bottom half of her face, and I felt by adding in a darker material in the shadow, it would add a kind of relative contrast that would tell us that the skin is actually still a light-colored material, even in the shadow. So you can see, before it looked very dark on the bottom half of the face, but now that I've added a black dress, this sort of relative contrast tells our brain, oh, okay, no, that is a light material, therefore that must be a shadow, and the whole thing starts to make more sense. Things like this can happen all the time in a drawing, where sort of design decisions and things like that can be sort of made for you by other elements in the drawing. So I wasn't really sure what sort of value or color dress I wanted to give her, but the specific problem created by the light source I'd chosen sort of led me down a path to make the decision to give her a black dress. And I find I really enjoy moments in a drawing where decisions are kind of made for you by other things already happening on the piece, and that's that kind of feeling of something unfolding organically. I personally don't feel the need to have every single element decided on or in my control. I kind of like the idea that the picture will sort of reveal what it needs as you work on it. Even things like the shape of the earrings I want to give her and stuff like that, you could really spend a lot of time thinking about what would help contrast or bring out your focal points accurately, or lead the eye around in a satisfying way. It doesn't, you can kind of let your drawing dictate what needs to be done next. So here you can see I'm beginning to work on an eye. So this is again, the whole drawing has kind of got to another level where everything is about in the same place. So I want to take one area and just try and push it to a higher level of finish, so I can try and figure out the sort of standard that I want to complete the entire picture to. So I've gone in and I mean, there are lots of little tricks for drawing eyes, but one thing to remember is that think about the direction that the light is coming from, and the sort of light part of the iris will usually be on the opposite side to the direction of the light source. So the light is coming from above right, at least it's a beam of light that must be obscured by, some form. It could be a crack in a wall or something like that, but the direction that the light is traveling in is from above right, and that means we want to choose the bottom left half of the eye to because it's a translucent, well, transparent, I guess, material. So it's just something you tend to notice when you look at eyes. And then the specular highlight should be angled. If you look at how spheres, if you want to sort of learn how to draw eyes properly, just keep remembering that they're sort of like a glossy sphere with eyelids obscuring half of them. So you'll see that the shape of the eyelids and the way that I render everything is all about implying that there is a sphere pushing outwards from the eye. And then there are lots of nuances and little subtle changes in form that vary from person to person around the eye socket. And really the only way to get good at doing that stuff is to use references when you get stuck, or to do as much portrait drawing as possible. A really good exercise, apart from the sort of still life thing that I was talking about earlier, is self-portraits. Someone contacted me recently just saying, they only had 2 hours a day to draw, and what would I recommend? And I think if you're really limited in time and you just want to get better quickly, self-portraits are a really good mixture of challenge, and you're always available as a model. You can learn lots about the way faces look, which I feel like a lot of people are interested in drawing faces. So give it a shot, do a lot of portraits, and just try and really pay attention in your day-to-day life. I mean, most of us will be seeing, if not other people, at least ourselves with a mirror whenever you want, throughout a lot of the day, and just sort of be that weird person who's always staring at other people's faces. And I'm always interested when I see someone who has sort of like a fold in their eyelid, or some shape to their brow bone that I've never seen before. And I don't think you have to go away and draw a million skulls, but it would definitely help to have some understanding of the structure of the skull as well, because everything about how light falls across the face is informed by the shape of the skull. If you look again at the eyes here, one thing you might notice is that there's not, I try not to leave too much actual white in the eyes. That's a bit of a, it's a really easy way to make everyone look absolutely crazy that you're drawing. Especially, you've got to be really careful about, the iris fills the eye a lot in a lot of positions. Seeing white of the eye above the iris is sort of a classic way to show crazy eyes, or show someone who looks terrified or distressed, and it can be a fun thing to do, but it'll mess up that portrait of your grandma if it looks like she's experiencing the deep existential horror of all of mankind at the same time. So instead, try not to have too much whites of the eyes visible, and instead think about subtly shading it like a sphere, but while also paying attention to how you've keyed your drawing. So while it's important to give them an appropriate sense of form. If you go in with too many values, then you're going to make them look like too much of a dark material, and that might mess things up again. So remember, it's all relative, and how much tone you put down and how much you leave blank is completely up to you. But it must all make sense relative to everything else on the drawing, and you never get that right first time. Rendering is like a constant back and forth of pushing things back, pulling them forwards again, and that's why I love a kneadable eraser. Working without one, to me, is missing out on everything that's good about graphite, because you can do things like you can just pluck off, you can sort of reduce the value by tiny amounts. You can lay in a tone and then just kind of dab it until it's like a third lighter or even more like that. And once you get used to using them, you can get a really, really sort of fine-tuning of your values. And I find the process of rendering like that very relaxing. I like to think of it as being similar to sculpting. You'll see here I'm like bringing out part of the brow and then pushing it back in, and I'm constantly thinking about how to add more and more complexity and subtlety, but without ruining the whole value scheme that I've set across the image. I don't think this is something that you can just get good at overnight, and I think the best way to improve at it, especially if you want to work without reference, would be to do lots of observational studies, and then in between those do studies from memory or imagination, if you want to call it that. Here's another instance where I'm trying to vary my materials again. So the lips were starting to look kind of washed out, and I thought it would be nice to bring the value down on them. So I just kind of shade across all of them, and once again it's that thing within the shadows. I want that relative contrast. So I'm looking again to make the skin. There's something kind of appealing to me about there's a big difference between the value on the highlight and in the shadows on the skin, but then there's still a big jump again to the material of the lips and the material of the hair and the material of the dress, and that gives it a kind of realistic complexity that I think it's really good to start thinking about. Just for reference and for fun, here's an example of a self-portrait I did about 9 years ago that shows just about everything you can do wrong at the same time. So every single material is rendered black to white and kind of in this strange no contrast way. My lines show absolutely no understanding of where the light's coming from. I've outlined my lips despite the fact that there aren't hard edges there. I've given myself some weird 70s sideburns that I didn't have as a 14-year-old, so maybe that was just sort of an aspirational detail. And then you'll notice that there's kind of a hint of understanding that the hair is a different material, but it's all very naive. But I think what's important and what I feel glad about is that this is from my sketchbook on conceptart.org, and I think it's really important just to dive in and start today or as soon as possible. Like, if you feel like you suck at drawing or you got a long way to go, absolutely everyone has had to learn exactly the same set of skills, and no one starts off good. Drawing definitely isn't some innate talent that you have or you don't. It's just about equipping yourself with the ability to solve different problems one at a time. So even if you've been trying for a long time and you don't feel like you've been making progress, then it's possible that something about the way you work or the frequency of how often you work or the kind of approach you've been having has been flawed. But I don't think anyone just can't get better. So what I would recommend if you really want to improve at pencil drawing is just to go away and tackle it with a greater consistency than maybe you have recently. Try doing a self-portrait every day for a week, or something that feels like you'd be pushing yourself and what you think you could do, because approaching the same problems and each day maybe try a slightly different working method. One day do a very detailed line drawing, the next day just go straight into rendering, and then maybe explore some of the places in between, and try to start understanding how it is you can display form on a flat surface. In this particular drawing, it's much less about the design and is much more about the actual rendering itself. The sort of focal point of the image is this creepy distortion to the to her face. It's kind of split in half in the middle, and then the top half has been pushed back and to the left. So my decision was that because this drawing is about it's the sort of the focal point is the distortion of the form, then I felt like focusing on the lighting would be the best way to emphasize that. So I chose basically a very simple background, and spent a bit of time just really trying to think about a light source that might have the kind of something about a small beam of bright light illuminating her in a dark room has a sort of moody, strange aesthetic to me. And I've never really been a fan of work that is just all out gory or violent or meant to shock people in a pure horror sense. So I like to sort of draw these people undergoing these strange looking things, transformations of their body or whatever, but I like to always have the facial expression look pretty calm, or maybe even a little bit like like it's happened before, or I think it adds to the sort of effect. Maybe it's just cheesy to you, but I don't know, I find it fun. Try and think of the time you spend drawing as just a way of exploring ideas and aesthetics. In a sense, when you make something, every drawing you're ever going to make will be destroyed one day by time. There's no escaping that. There's no museum. There's no archive that anything will ever really last. It'll be swallowed up by the sun if you're the greatest artist of all time. And entropy will win, probably. So I like to think, in some sense, drawing is basically like a more complicated version of building sandcastles. It's not really about an end result. It's obviously fun to share your images with people because it's kind of like a little imprint of the kind of person you are, maybe. But in the end, it shouldn't be about any kind of final result. It's more about the experience you get to have making them and the kind of places it'll take your thinking. Otherwise, it's going to be really hard to stay motivated if you're trying to do it for some external motivation, because there will never be enough people viewing your work. The drawing will never be of a high enough quality. It's an unwinnable game, but what you can do is really enjoy the process. And it sounds super cheesy, but I think trying to get as much as possible into that sort of, I guess you could call it like playing, would be the goal. A flow state maybe. But just really enjoying the actual act of drawing, and stop worrying so much about how they turn out. That'll take care of itself over time. And I feel the same way about studying. Don't turn studying art into this heavy, boring task, and instead I think of it as a kind of visual mindfulness. When you do life drawing, it's this kind of weird experience where you're really trying to break down and understand the way your brain is representing the world around you. I mean, if you really think about what's going on from a sort of scientific perspective in the room you're in, and the sort of chaos of all these swarms of atoms around you, and somehow your brain is turning it into this crisp image that you're experiencing right now in the moment, and then sitting down and just trying to learn to replicate that with other tools, it's like a beautiful kind of meditation. And anatomy studies don't have to just be this boring academic thing. Instead, just think about how bizarre the human body is, and what an amazing sort of mechanical system it is, and try and turn it into something that you want to know, and I think it becomes 100 times easier, and I think you will progress a lot better than if it's just a sort of strange cycle of shame and self-doubt and entirely worrying about how you're going to make money from art, which is, I mean, rightfully so, a huge issue. There's obviously a lot of economic pressure, especially if you're a young person like myself trying to turn this into your job, but you'll ruin art and you'll turn it into something that you can't find the motivation to do if that's all you ever think about. So I think regardless of where you are, whether you're employed full-time or you're a student trying to make this your job, or who knows, just I think trying to make the space to make personal work really personal again is very important to me. Part of the mindset I want to be in when I'm working is I don't want to be worrying about what time of day it is or what else is happening in my life, or and obviously the less you can worry about these things, that is an expression of your, you know, a lot of people don't have the luxury of not being able to worry about the time of day if you have people that depend on you, or if you have a lot going on. But just trying to find, I think most people find the time if they really want to. Everyone finds the time to watch Game of Thrones, everyone finds the time to play some video games, and if drawing is something really important to you, just try not to set it up as, don't make it sound like homework. Turn it into something that can be fun. In a lot of ways, my decision to sort of keep focusing on pencil has been economically a strange one. A lot of people that I used to, that sort of came out of conceptart.org and forums that I was on at the same time, are working, very high-profile jobs in games and movies, and it's very easy to sit back and feel like it might have been a weird decision, but I have so much fun doing the work I do, and I find a way to get by, and in the end I'm really glad that I did that. And I like to think that it's more of a long-term strategy. There are a lot of people that I see in the world of illustration and fine art who have found a way to do exactly the kind of work that they want to do, but I think it just takes a long time. And if you're not going to, there are sort of two kinds of professional you can be as an artist, and being a concept artist or an illustrator or even a fine artist sometimes is often about being very, very good at delivering what someone else needs visually. But sort of being a truly sort of indie artist or independent requires, you can't just be good at drawing. I think you have to have a very developed personal aesthetic or sort of thing that people can come to you for, and that's not something that I think can be forced or rushed. So if you need to make money in the short term, it's always good just to increase your technical skills, learn new software, learn more about how to communicate with your drawing, but don't put yourself in a box, because I mean you can fail at being an artist you didn't want to be, or you can at least fail doing the work that excites you. So for now, enough of my ramblings about drawing and more about what I'm doing here on the actual picture. So this has kind of reached a point now where in a lot of ways you could say it's finished at any point you like. There's a sense of where the light's coming from, the idea is coming across, and I think it's kind of beginning to reach that point where, like, if someone walked into the room and then walked back in a couple hours later, it wouldn't be super obvious what's changed if they weren't looking for it. But whenever I reach this point, this is where I like to go and look at the artists that I really admire, people who've taken their work to a sort of very high technical or aesthetic standard, and I like to sometimes I'll take a break for a day and come back to this image with a sort of fresh mindset. And I like to imagine that you can always ask simple questions like, how could this be better? And you just take your picture one area at a time and just keep thinking about how you can improve the quality of the drawing, the quality of the values, and all with respect to the idea. And I think that must be how to come up with something that has a real sense of mastery around it. When you look at for me, it would be like a Beksinski painting, or like an Andrew Wyeth, or a Waterhouse, or a Mucha. There's just a level of quality that there's almost like a glass ceiling between people who are good, and then that ridiculous, domination of the media. And I think it must ultimately come down to patience and the vision to keep seeing how something could get better. If I really cared about this idea, it would be good to go away and redraw it to this level twice more, and think about how I could change it and what I could add, and then maybe you do an oil painting. When you look at like a Repin painting, and they say there's a painting by Repin called The Cossacks that's incredible, and we had a museum tour once, and she said it took him 10 years to paint or something, and you think, well, what does that mean? Is that 10 years of him working on it every day? And it's undoubtedly not that, but it's 10 years encapsulates the total time of research, sketching, hiring models, preliminary work, and then the actual time spent on the painting. So the only way to get the sort of better and better results is to put more and more thought and patience into projects. So right now here I'm getting my hard eraser tool and just subtly adjusting curves and forms, and really going in and trying to visualize how these things would look, and sort of not settling for good enough where possible. I continuously layer graphite and get darker and darker as it goes along. That's one of my favorite things about graphite, is it responds very, very well to layering. Charcoal is a medium where if you try and layer it too much, you can kind of damage the paper grain and ruin your ability to get full darks in there. But graphite just becomes, like, to me, smoother and smoother, and more complex and appealing the more you layer it. So that's why you'll have noticed, if you skip back through this video and kind of skip forward in 10-minute chunks, you'll see there's just a very gradual step towards darker and darker. But at one point, when I was keying the drawing, I chose a few areas that I was sure would be black, and I went straight in there with a black value just so that I could get an idea of the whole value range. Specifically right here, I'm trying to figure out how I want to handle the cheekbone on the other side of her face. I know that I've left the sort of highlights overexposed, but I'm starting to think about getting really, I want to sort of subtly have the bridge of the nose and the cheekbones just a tiny bit brighter than, say, the turning value as the cheek turns away, or a little bit of her brow between her eyebrows. So these are the kind of small shifts in form that might seem insignificant, but the sort of combined effect of getting them all right at the same time is a sort of better depth and realism. And that's something you really learn to pick up from life studies, is that the more you look, the more you see. It's almost like there's an infinite level of detail, not only in things like texture and proportion and form, but in values too. What at first looks like a completely flat surface, often turns out to have all these little nuances and stuff that you didn't see before. And I think that can be a lot of fun to go in and try and add that same kind of same complexity to your work. Right now I'm starting to really push the darks on the shadow on the hair. It's important to me that there's a strong sense of contrast and that it reads clearly, that there's a sort of shape to the beam of light hitting her head, so I'm just reinforcing that. I'm going in on the neck here to sort of really turn the sides of the neck and make sure that without ruining the value range within the shadow, I'm still turning forms and not leaving anything too flat. The reason why it's darker under her chin, even though it's all in shadow at the same time, is because I want to kind of imply that the space she's in is also it's big. It's not like if you see like a Caravaggio painting where everything is sort of there's a word for it that I should know, but I've forgotten, where it's bright shapes on top of a black background. That's sort of what it would look like if you were in a dark room with only a single light source. But by leaving these values and by putting some extra depth in the shadows within the shadows on my drawing, I'm kind of implying maybe she's outside or in a big space that has some ambient light bouncing around. It's not just completely dark within the shadows. An occlusion shadow, which is what's going on, say, under her jawline, where we have this kind of fade to a darker value, is where when forms overlap on top of each other, the probability of any photons kind of taking a path there and bouncing into your eye becomes less and less, so the value will drop and drop, which is why even in shadows you see a sort of you'll see things get darker where two forms come together or overlap, and that's really helpful for creating a better sense of space and light in your pictures. Another technique I'm using to help my forms to read better is a terminator line in the shadow on the left-hand side of her face, our left. You'll see that the darkest point of the shadow is where it sort of turns, or where it is turning from light into dark, and then sort of value becomes a little brighter again on the edge of the face. This happens in any lighting situation where there's some bounced light, and the darkest point of the shadow is where it's turned away enough that that it's not in the light anymore, but it hasn't turned enough to start picking up the bounced light. And you'll see that all the time, especially if you look up like Russian Academy figure drawings. It's or the way comic book illustrators often render is just with a lot of emphasis on the terminator lines or the coarse shadow. It tends to really makes your forms really pop. But if you do it too much, everything looks like the Silver Surfer, and that can be kind of funny too, like a sort of chrome world. But all things to consider, and all things, the best way you will learn them is by not only understanding them intellectually, but having gone through the process of copying them and drawing them and making it kind of second nature to your head. You want light and form and design to be sort of as ingrained in your brain as grammar is. You know, when you hear bad grammar in your native language, you don't have to choose to hear it. It just jumps out at you because it's, and that's not innate. That's not some feature of the human brain. That's just a really good way of demonstrating what practice will do. And the same thing happens. Can happen visually. Luckily, sort of the bandwidth of information that our brain can process visually is huge. You know, we take in huge amounts of information, and there's massive amounts of brain architecture dedicated to understanding them and making things make sense. And in a sense, all of the hard work is done for us by our brain. But learning to understand these things consciously gives you the ability to control them and manipulate them to your advantage. So just the more time you spend doing life drawing is, in my opinion, is very important, because it will teach you it'll teach you a lot more about values than drawing from photos will. Not that I have any problem with drawing from photos. It's fantastic for studying form and proportion and all kinds of other things, but you'll just miss out on a little bit of the depth that you can study from life. So you can just do this until it's kind of a language that your brain is fluent in. And I mean, in theory, I don't think you ever master it. And eventually, I think you just want to know it good enough to achieve the kind of ideas you're interested in communicating. Technical talk aside, I never wanted to be someone, I don't want to make work that is purely technical masturbation. which to me is when, like, the worst thing would be to make a drawing that I felt I had to explain to people why they should think it's good. I kind of feel this way about when you see like hyperreal portraits of Morgan Freeman on Instagram, where someone has drawn every single freckle and, you know, in coloring pencils or whatever. When you really think about it, the thing that you're being asked to appreciate in that context is the fact that they drew it, because it's not their picture, it's a picture of someone that already existed, it's not their design. Everything about what you're sort of being asked to appreciate is just the fact that someone went through the labor. And I think there's a place for that, and I think that that can be interesting, and I don't really want to flat out say anyone's doing anything wrong, but to me, the ultimate goal should be to make something that would be interesting, even if it wasn't a drawing. I don't want to have someone to have to think like, well, you know, this is boring, I don't care about this, but I guess it's cool because it must have been hard to draw that. To me, that would kind of classify as a failure. Instead, I think I want everything, all the sort of technical skills that I learn are purely just to give me sort of language to communicate idea or mood or aesthetic better in. Now might be a good point to talk about edges, because at this point in the rendering, that's basically most of what I'm working on is, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, small changes in form and edge quality. So everyone knows about hard and soft edges, or maybe they don't, I don't know, but you have hard edges and you have soft edges. But in the same way you key your value range, it's a good concept to think about keying your edges. Something you'll notice when you set up like a still life or look at a portrait or anything is you can quickly identify on your subject the hardest edge. And what that means is look across your subject and try to find where you think the absolute hardest edge with the highest contrast is. And then in the same way that you choose your brightest value and you make sure nothing else is brighter than that to ensure that it has enough impact, you should do the same with your edges. You should think about the hardest edge, and then you should make sure that other edges, even if you feel like they're sharp, should be just a little bit softer. A general kind of rules for deciding edges is edges tend to be softer in lower light, softer in the shadows than they are in the light. Cast shadows and hard changes in form tend to make very hard edges. If you have something in the light in front of a dark background that has hard edges, you'll normally get very, very sharp edges there. Or if you have something casting a shadow over a form and it's like a point light source and quite close to the form it's casting a shadow on, that tends to leave quite hard edges too. Though cast shadow edges blur the further away the thing casting the shadow is from the surface it's casting onto. And they also blur in more diffuse light. Like you might notice that you can't really see your shadow on a cloudy day, and that's because the light is kind of being scattered and coming from everywhere. So it's very hard to, you know, have any hard edges on a shadow in that situation. So to think about your edges properly, you're going to once again have to maybe have some experience with understanding how edges look in real life a lot of the time. And I think it's a really good idea to it's another tool that you can use to dictate where the eye focuses. You'll see that I'm blurring areas that have a similar value where I don't feel like the edge is necessary anymore. In fact, I don't really have a clear edge for the entire edge of her neck and sort of trapezius, and instead I've let the shape of her hair and the shape of the edge of the dress collar where it wraps around just tell you enough about where the neck is, and then I'm just letting all the rest of the edges blur, and I'm starting to blur parts of the hair into the background and blur the dress into the background, and all of this is really helpful for sort of having things not jump out so much and moving away from like lines are the first thing you learn to draw, but a line is sort of fundamentally an abstraction. A line represents an edge, and normally we put lines where there's a sudden change in value. So as you sort of render things out, it's really good to stop thinking in terms of line and contour, and maybe start thinking in terms of edge and edge intensity, and just blocks of value coming in front of each other, and ultimately light. It's all about light, really. Unless it's not. I mean, if you're if you want to bring in a big influence of graphic art styles and stuff like that, there's tons of cases where you might just be a fan of doing line drawing. But I still think understanding some of this stuff will help you make better and better decisions about how to use lines efficiently. And that is ultimately the fun of drawing, is that all of these things I'm talking about, as if they're rules, aren't rules. And if you feel like sort of scribbling on top of your drawing, or doing some mixed media experiments, whatever, it's I think a lot of people, we live in a pretty cynical time, and I think a lot of people are very sick of modern and contemporary art. But if you stop viewing it as something that's in competition for you, and sort of expand your idea a bit about how you can express things visually, I think it's very fun to play around with how you can merge this kind of traditional representational knowledge with a whole wealth of really talented people who've been working in different styles. This piece is pretty, it hasn't really got anything too crazy going on stylistically. It's pretty much just a rendered object, but I have a lot of other drawings where I'll involve more graphic elements, or it's definitely something I'd like to explore more. So here you can see I'm using a tissue here to just kind of really soften up and rub areas together, and for a while I was going to try and have little beams of dust suspended in the sort of light beam, and in hindsight, looking at the footage, I think they look quite cool, but for whatever reason I decided against them. I think it was somehow taking away from the impact, or at least I felt like it was at the time. But I really, really like to use things like I have a mixture of the kind of grainy look that rubbing my graphite stick on the paper will leave, with very smoothed out tissue blending, and then on top of that I go in with the pencil and just sort of hatch in little patches. And when you're hatching with a pencil, I like to think about, it's almost like I'm imagining a brush stroke and I'm filling it in by hatching in a sort of blocky fashion. I'll take a little plane that I want to emphasize, and then I just kind of hatch along that plane with all the lines going in the same direction. So it almost ends up being like a kind of rectangle made up of little lines in a row. And then I like to think of those rectangles kind of like brush strokes, and I sort of use them to sculpt form, and sometimes I like to leave things really hatchy. It's quite fun. To get soft edges, you don't need to use soft techniques. It's just like everything on the drawing, it's all relative. You can have soft drawings on an etching plate that's entirely made up of sharp lines, just by having I don't know if any of you work in Photoshop a lot, but there's this very popular brush that people use that's kind of a bundle of just a bundle of straight lines in random directions, and it's really good for softening edges, despite the fact that it's just made up of tons of hard lines. Because to disrupt an edge, you don't actually need to get an airbrushed soft look, you just need to break up the continuous sharp line. So that's something to think about. It's a different kind of contrast you can play with. To me, drawing is most fun when it's at this intersection between sort of technical knowledge and fuck it, I'll do what I like. And the people that I really look up to the most are people who sort of play around with that in really interesting and unexpected ways. One of the easiest ways to get a soft edge in pencil is to block in, let's say you have an intersection between a lighter value or paper white and a midtone. I tend to fill in the midtone a little further than I want the edge to be, and then using the kneadable eraser, I sort of press and pick at the graphite on the paper until it blends out appropriately into the value. So I kind of bring the pencil a little further than feels right, and then I use the soft eraser to cut into that value, and that kind of lets it blend into the paper more smoothly. One of the final things I wanted to do was I kind of had the idea here that it would be fun for that top plane of the sort of bottom half of the face to be like a sort of like a polished stone or something, with the highlights from the top half reflecting in it, so it looks like it's kind of sat on top of it. So I'm going in here with an eraser and pencil and just kind of trying to give a sense of there being a reflection. Actually, one of the trickiest areas of this whole drawing, and it helped the most, is on the left hand side of the bottom half of the face, where as it curves away, you'll notice that on the right hand side of that curve, where the face is split, the skin is brighter than the top plane, but then over on the left hand side, where the sort of face is turned into the shadow, the top plane is now lighter than the bottom plane. And I like looking for things like this, where you can have along an edge, it goes from being darker on one side to lighter on the other side. And this is a really fun effect to play with. This is also a good time to start thinking about textures and the kind of details that will add that extra level of polish. This is, once everything is pretty much established value-wise and drawing-wise, I think it can be fun to go in and then do things like add the little creases in the lips, or little tiny specular highlights on the lips and in the eye, or sort of the lower eyelashes and the textures of the eyelid and the eyebrow hairs and stray hairs on the side of the head, or whatever. Maybe it's patterns on someone's clothing, but it's just the sort of finishing touches that I think are honestly the easiest part and kind of the fun part to do, provided you've made sure the drawing underneath them is good enough that it won't just look kind of weird. There's something a little bit unsatisfying about over-detailed images that have very big structural foundational problems, which is why that stuff is so important to get right at the beginning. Here you can see that I'm just going in and deciding that I want to put that edge in a little bit on the neck, because I'm darkening the background value some more. And that's another decision in hindsight. I can't tell if I like or not, but that's okay. You never are really fully satisfied with anything. I'm like narrowing the bridge of the nose here and just kind of softening part of the way the brow is turning into that eye, and just lots of small things like this, bringing out the lower eyelids. And here I'm doing things like adding freckles and skin marks, which I just kind of do with as light a touch as I can, and then I go in and dab them with a kneadable eraser to make them even more subtle so that it doesn't look too strange. And I think I moved that dress collar around like a million times because I didn't really draw it properly in the beginning. So I think if you skip around, it's moved up and down and changed a whole bunch, but I think it's got somewhere that I'm fairly happy with by the end. I'm going in again and just like making sure that the dark underneath the lips and inside the nostrils is dark enough, considering that I still want to maintain a sense of contrast even within the shadows, and small things like this. And this process could go on forever, and if you do a really in-depth life study, you really can just do this for an infinite amount of time. You'll always notice more stuff, but eventually I tend to get bored, want to work on something else, or it starts to feel a little bit self-indulgent, like it would be better just to come up with a better idea than it is to just keep rendering something forever. But it is fun sometimes just to see how far you can push something, or just to sort of go on a little bit longer than maybe you normally would, to see if you don't notice more things, or it's easy to confuse like being done with just kind of being impatient, and it's always hard to balance that out. So, hopefully that has been at least a little bit helpful at showing maybe how I'd approach a piece like this. There was about 8 hours of real-time footage, and I think this was spread over like two and a half days of working time. I tend to have trouble really focusing on anything for more than like 4 hours solid in a day. A lot of maybe other people have better stamina than me, or maybe people procrastinate and exaggerate their work hours, or maybe people take a lot of Adderall, but I really lose my ability to be doing effective work after about 4 hours on one project. I can then switch it up and do something else, or sort of force your way through it if you're on a deadline. But to me, that's the ideal range of where something can stay fun, but that's still a lot of time, especially if you're really focused and concentrating hard. I guess the last thing to think about would be how to decide what it is that you want to draw, and how to figure out your personal work again. And I think the best thing to do is think about it in terms of your experience as the person drawing it and the experience of the person viewing it, because experiences are what we really value as human beings. So on one level, it should be fun for you, like I was saying earlier. You should enjoy the experience of making the piece of work you're doing, and it should be ultimately something that you're interested to see happen. You sort of get the front row seat to watching your strange little ape drawing come into the world, and I think you want to be doing something where you're happy to have seen that happen, and feel like you're bringing something into the world that you hadn't seen before and you wanted to see. And then you should also try and think about the experience of, wow, this is some bad camera work. You should think about the experience of the person looking at it, and what kind of ideas really appeal to people and are interesting to people. So I like to try and sort of channel things that I'm insecure about, or things that I worry about or get anxiety about, or ideas that I find awe-inspiring, or just the kind of things that really capture my attention. And those are the things I want to try and express in the work I'm doing. And yeah, this last part I had to put it down on a table, because honestly, working on a little desk easel was pretty hard to maintain a steady hand. And as you can see, if I was working without a camera, I tend to move that angle of the sketchbook around all the time, just so I can get a really nice hand position to touch up an edge or something like that. I hope my rambling hasn't been too incoherent, and I haven't said too much. It's pretty hard to think about all the things I want to say, but thank you very much for watching it. And I didn't want to make this video like 5 hours long, because I know realistically I wouldn't watch it. And just thank you very much for the support and for getting hold of this. And I look forward to hopefully continuing to develop the kind of work I make. I'm open to making more tutorials if that's something anyone is interested in. Anything more specific, like I could record some life drawing, or I could tackle a piece that has a lot more of the kind of weird, organic, psychedelic looking stuff that I do. This one was kind of simple. It's something I'm open to, and yeah, I just really appreciate that you watched this. And if you felt like you were left with any questions that were unanswered, please feel free to message me and get in touch, and I will try my best to either address that in a later video or give you an answer over email or messenger or whatever. Good luck, have fun, and thank you very much.